Vietnam, a small ancient country just south of China and nestled against Cambodia and Laos, it became engulfed in two wars during the 20th century, the First and the Second Indochina Wars. During the second, it became the longest American-involved war at that time. Images of the war aired nightly on the news, and it became known as the Television War. It also became known as the Helicopter War, as the rough jungle terrain made it impossible to move troops around by conventional transportation. Instead, they were dropped by Huey helicopters into hotspots in a chaotic way to go where they were needed at any particular moment. Jungle warfare had no clearly defined front lines, and this caused American soldiers to constantly improvise the way they had to fight. Those who received orders to go home struggled with the conflicting emotions of wanting to get out of there, but not wanting to leave the other guys behind. This is not a documentary about the Vietnam War itself. Rather, it is an opportunity for several veterans who served in that war to tell you about what they experienced during their time in Vietnam, in their own words.
Yes, my name is Brian Wilson. I served in the United States Navy from 1970 to 74, made 3 cruises to Vietnam, and I worked in CIC. It stood for Combat Information Center. Some people joke that it stood for Christ, I'm confused. But we operated the ship's weapon systems, and our primary job was navigation and operating the surface search radar.
James V. Barnhart, and I go by Jim. I was 23 years old when I entered military. I got my first notice of the draft in 1963. I'm thinking October of 1963. Our orders, I think, said that we were going to report to a undisclosed location in a classified location. It's really not a good experience to have to leave your family and go off to a country that you have no idea what's going to happen. I had to not think about them all the time. That's kind of sad too. But
I got my draft notice in 64, and I turned it in. I said, I'm not going in the Army. No way, Jose. I'm not going to pound ground, you know, like the Army guys. So I joined the Navy. You're lucky you got me in a situation where I can remember a little bit, you know.
My name is George Snyder. I was 23 years old. I was the son of a military man, and so I decided that I wanted to go in the Army and fly helicopters.
And I remember sitting on a curbside in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, right outside of a post office. It was one of those horrible Southeast Missouri days, and snow was on the ground. And I said, you know, I'm lost here. I don't know what to do. And I looked up and I saw this A sign outside the post office. And I looked over there and there was this Marine, lantern-jawed, hard-looking Marine in dress blue uniform. And it said one word across the top. It said, ready? And I said, you know, by God, I think I am. And the next day I went in and enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. That was in January of 1964.
I go by Butch, but my real name is Melvin Morgan. I volunteered in March of 1963 while I was still in high school. Well, over that year from 64 to 65, between letters and phone calls, I'd go to on paydays, I'd go to the phone booth at the USO there in Oceanside. I asked her if we could write to each other, just to have somebody to write to. I said, well, I'm going off to war. She said, I'm going to wait. And I said, you're going to wait? And she said, yeah, I'm going to wait on you. I said, no, you're not. He said, oh, yes, I am. She's worth marrying. So I sent the wedding engagement ring to her and the wedding band home to Mom, which I heard later that I was crazy again, and asked her to marry me when I returned, if I returned. This next Sunday, we'll be married 57 years.
Oh, you are hereby ordered for induction into the Armed Forces of the United States and to report to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. I was 23 years old when I went into the military. I was not married, but I got married right after I got out of basic training in April of 1964. Did not know I was going to Vietnam at that time.
And I joined to go to Vietnam. I was in favor of doing that. I didn't know what to expect, but I had just about, when I decided to join the Army, I had pretty much decided that it was going to be a career choice.
I called home and Mom answered, and I said, Mom, I need to talk to Dad. And she said, what about that? I said, I just need to talk to Dad about something. And Mom put Dad on, and I said, Dad, Mom, I'm not going to like what I'm going to tell you. She said, why? And I said, I'm on the docks. I said, I sail at 5:30 in the morning to Vietnam. And he said, Vietnam? And I said, yes, Vietnam. I said, we're going to war. And he said, you know your mother's going to throw a fit over that. And I heard Mom in the background said, throw a fit over what? He said, oh, he'll tell you here in a minute.
Too few Americans, especially in the post-World War II generation, really had military experience.
The one thing that I look back on is they didn't teach us anything about the mission. They just taught us how to fly. There was a particular phrase that I won't repeat that they called us. It was an FNG. That's what they called us. And you basically had to prove yourself to them. Well, maybe back up. You have to remember, I was flying with kids that were 19 years old, 20 years old. I was an old man. Going through flight school and all the training in the Huey and everything, they never did any of that kind of stuff. It was like, if we tell you what it's really like over there, you won't go. You know, there would have been a real high rate of people quitting and going to Canada or whatever to keep from going there. But you learn real quick to just tune it out and do the job.
But then over there in Vietnam, they sent these young kids out of officer training school, and they didn't know their, jack beans, of what was going on, because it wasn't in the book. So I flew into Da Nang and got off the plane, World Airways, I think it was, or something like that. Got off the plane, walked over about 300 meters, got on a helicopter. And they says, you got to sit down in this helicopter, but you got to sit on your pack. And I said, okay. And so we're flying along, and all of a sudden this guy says, oh, I kind of sore in my butt. I said, where's your pack? Oh, on my back. No, you're supposed to be sitting on that. I told the gunner there, I said, well, you're going to have to take him back. I said, he just got shot in the ass. Well, how do you know? I said, just by the way he acted. Well, who are you? I said, I'm the hospital corpsman of this group. Oh, okay, I'll take your word for it.
We had to do shots twice a week. And those shot lines were long with air guns shooting in both arms at the same time. And those times, I've seen people's arm get ripped because they would jerk and cut their arm open, and I've seen people pass out. And to this day, I do not like needles because of that. They don't use air guns anymore, but I see a needle coming at me, I cringe.
And I immediately began to understand why the first word in the title of Marine Corps Combat Correspondent is combat, because that's where they needed us and that's where they wanted us to go.
When I entered boot camp the very first time and put my feet on those yellow footprints, above the doorway of our entryway into boot camp was the words of the Marine Corps were, believe in yourself, believe in your company, believe in the Corps, and believe in God. And that is still there today as far as I know. They haven't changed that.
On our way over, we stopped at Okinawa, and we stayed overnight at Okinawa. And when we got off the ship, they charged everybody $1, and then they fed us a great meal. But that evening, somehow some of the guys got away from the ship and didn't report back to the ship when we sailed the next morning. So they went into Okinawa, and I have no idea what happened to them. I'm sure they were AWOL, so I'm sure that wasn't good. And then one night we had a obstacle course that we had to go through, and we did it at night, and they set up concertina wire on the ground, and then they had live machine guns firing over us. And to me, it looked really low because, like, I don't know, every so often there was a tracer. It seemed like, again, solid tracers. And you had to get underneath that concertina wire to get on the other side. And what happened, they kept telling us, don't raise up, don't get up. And they had loudspeakers, I guess, that, but I know all of a sudden as we were going under that, somebody he stood up and he got hurt, and you could hear this all over the loudspeaker, him crying and carrying on. Well, not crying, but yelling and carrying on.
Because we were in the Gulf of Tonkin. Okay, again, we were with the aircraft carrier Constellation. And there was a typhoon coming across the Pacific, west to east. It was kind of heading towards the Philippines. Well, then it decided to take a right turn and was coming right towards the Gulf. All right. So we got word, I don't remember what category it was, but it was a nasty one because we had to go right through it. See, if you look on a map, the Gulf of Tonkin, it's landlocked on three sides. You got the Vietnams, you got China, and then Hainan Island, which is part of China. So the only way in and out of the Gulf is south. So we had to head south and went right through the middle of that typhoon. For 24 hours, our ship, I thought, was going to sink. It was pretty scary. I shouldn't laugh. Because when we hit a trough, okay, the ship had come up and it would just shudder and shake like it was going to break apart. Okay. Sometimes you get a big wave hit the ship and you get thrown up against the wall. Next thing you know, you're on your hands and knees on the floor. And oftentimes we just stayed there. Wherever we were going, we just crawled on our hands and knees. It was easier than trying to stand up. So that was no fun. But we got through it. And in fact, there were, I want to say, 2 aircraft carriers and about 12 other support ships. We all had to get out of the Gulf that time.
And when we pulled guard duty, now we walked the perimeter of Tent City A. We only had 10 rounds of ammunition. We had to carry it in our ammo pack, never in the rifle. What good were we as guards with, you have to get it was just I don't understand the military and what their concept was about that or why they even made us do it, because we wasn't, and we had no walkie-talkies, you had no communication. But I guess we were walking the perimeter, and usually a lot of the area was close to where the people were sleeping, like the different tent cities that you went around. And it was, I don't understand the military and what they're thinking. They told us that what happened prior to us getting there, that the GIs would go downtown and get too much to drink. And when they come back across the border, if you didn't know exactly who they were and you hollered halt, sometimes they did not holler halt, and then some of the guys got shot. And that's what they told us, why we couldn't carry the ammo and a rifle. The military has a way of I think, I don't know if I want to say breaking you down, but they have a way of changing you to their way of thinking.
The only guys I did not trust were the lieutenants. And I think that's because they didn't know any better. Because they were right out of college, right out of officer training school. And what you learn in the book, it don't work in reality. Well, on Apocalypse, you see that show, the guy stands up and, starts giving orders. Nothing happens. He lights a cigarette. Over in Vietnam, you light a cigarette, you're dead.
And the other thing that was really rampant towards the end was drug use. I mean, horrible drug use. I mean, even pilots. I mean, it was so easy, so readily available. One of the things that I will say is when I went to Vietnam, I stopped drinking. A lot of guys go to Vietnam and start drinking. And I flew with one fella that would go to the club, drink until they closed, go to bed, get up the next morning and fly. It was amazing that he could do that.
Well, I was always in Da Nang and a little bit south and mostly north, up to the DMZ, and the nature of the war had really changed. I think everyone was fairly tired of the situation in Vietnam, including the people who were there fighting the war, because we didn't seem to be making any visible progress. We didn't seem to be accomplishing the things that we had come to understand were success in battle, in war. It was the same hill over and over again, and the same piece of ground over and over again.
Me and the sergeant were sitting along this nice little river coming out into the ocean, watched across a village that was sitting on the other side. You could see the tracers going up and tracers coming down. Sitting there just talking. We hadn't dug in very high because they said, "Oh, you ain't going to be here very long." We sat there just visiting, watching all this, and all of a sudden, 2 rounds hit between us, and we were probably 5 or 6 yards apart. Got dug in and everything, and next thing we know, we see a bunch of Marines running across the creek, river, or whatever you want to call it, over this village. And pretty soon we heard some explosions in it. I guess they'd find a spider trap, what they call a spider trap, underneath a fire pit that Vietnamese had dug underneath. It was hiding down in and got back in it. And I guess they blew them out of it. But that was pretty close on that one. But on that same beach, a few hours later, this woman with a child come through the lines at some point. I don't know where they came from. But I could see them walking across several yards away. And this lieutenant colonel was out front of what they was CP at the time. It was the Amtracs. And he stepped in and stopped them. Nobody seemed to move, so he jumped up on the Amtrak with the M60 on it and fired at it and hit the woman in the leg. The child with her wasn't hurt. Approached her and found out on her back she had munitions of explosives ready to pull the string on her to set them off and try to get to the CP to knock it out.
We went out and took care of the small arms that the recon had found. Did that for about 3 flights, And then once we got, then they put me in with this platoon, and I went out to Liberty Bridge, and we walked right into a hamlet, which is a village, and walked right into a hamlet, and we started getting small arms fire from it. So we just walked right by. And I thought that was stupid. But we walked right by. Went up, stayed on the hill, and turned around and walked right back in there. And I thought, this is stupid. Why don't you take care of it at the time? But I'm not a lieutenant. The hospital corpsman had a 3-second lifespan during a firefight. The lieutenant was number 1, radio man was number 2, we was number 3, and then the sergeant was number 4. And if those four got killed, they had the platoon.
Come up around the bend, and all of a sudden you see green tracers going over the top of your head about 6 inches above the cab of your truck. And my shotgun guy, one of my friends, riding shotgun, bailed out. The only thing is I couldn't get my rifle out because it was in behind the emergency brake. The first sergeant had been trying to get me to carry a 45. I said, no, the rifle will be good enough for me. I started carrying a 45 after that. Another time was walking, another close one, was a path that we were following. Again, I was doing point. Well, I always end up point, I don't know to this day, but it seemed like I always drew the point person. And of course, my job was looking up in the trees and straight ahead for pops and ambushes. Again, I was jerked back, this time by the sergeant who was behind me, and he pointed down. And something was kind of funny about the way the ground in front of me was, so we carefully took a long pole that we found, a stick, and started raking away the leaves and the branches and stuff around it. And it was, in that hole was called punji sticks. And they were dipped in human waste or whatever they could find to be called poison. And those sticks were angled at different angles. If you stepped on them or scraped your leg or anything, it would give you blood poisoning.
There was a mission, and that mission was more important than any individual consideration. And it could only be accomplished if they trusted and relied on the man on the right and the man on their left.
And a lot of guys deliberately wanted to go to guns because you weren't down and dirty. I mean, you're flying around with all kinds of firepower, and if people are shooting at you, you're shooting back. Your exposure time is very low compared to the people that are doing the combat assaults and things like that. So, I mean, I personally know people that went to Vietnam and flew helicopters for a year and never got shot at. Yeah. And I know other guys that got shot down 3 or 4 times. When you get down very close to the trees, you pull the nose of the helicopter way up, point it up in the air, and let the helicopter fall tail first into the trees to help cushion the impact. We hit a dike between the rice paddies. They had these dikes up where they walked around the rice paddies and stuff, and the aircraft flipped over. Nobody got hurt. Well, nobody got severely hurt. Fortunately, we were within about maybe a quarter of a mile from a fire base. They knew we were going down. So we had protection. You get out of it quick because you're obviously worried about fire. The Hueys had what they called crash-worthy fuel tanks in them, but on an impact like that, they would typically rupture. So if you had a lot of fuel on board, you could have a fire. First thing you do is make sure everybody's capable of moving, and take whatever weapons you can, the M60 machine guns, and your personal weapons, and run like hell.
From the days of Vietnam to the days of today, there is no front like there were during World War II. A lot of your things are guerrilla warfare in cities, and Vietnam was mostly guerrilla warfare.
And this one guy, lieutenant, he comes out, he's standing up there like John Wayne, you know, and giving orders, and he only said one word. Next word was, boop, down on the ground. I hung a toe tag on him. And then we'd send the bodies to Da Nang. and they'd put them in. We'd send them in body bags, and then they would take them. I don't know if they took them out of the body bags or if they just put them in a casket and sent them over United States. That was in Cambodia, but I don't know for sure. We were on a need-to-know basis, and we didn't need to know that.
We were heavily armed, just as the infantrymen were. So when there was a hole in the line or a person was wounded, you might move forward and pull him out of the line of fire, rescue him to the point where a corpsman, a Navy corpsman, a hospital corpsman could work on him. And then you were expected to get back in that line and replace his rifle and get into the fighting. You threw grenades and did whatever was necessary. And you learned by experience what was necessary, what was really needed here. And certainly what was needed at critical moments like that was not sitting there in the rear, taking notes or taking photographs. You were obligated to get in there and help, and we did.
We were supposed to be a maximum of 30 minutes away from them, and we went in to pick them up and ended up crashing, and those guys saved us. They had to bring in other helicopters and pick us up on ropes. They couldn't land. And so Hueys would come in, and they hooked into the tie downs on the floor with ropes that had about every 10 foot a carabiner tied into the end of it. And they would drop one out each side, and they'd pick up two guys on each side at a time. So you're flying 100 feet under the helicopter back to wherever they can set you down and get you inside the helicopter. And so that was kind of scary.
Those big guns that go over the hill and bomb our ammo dump. But we were in bunkers. They had reinforced bunkers there that were about 40 foot deep, and they really wouldn't bother us. We'd stay down there until they got done, and then we'd go back up and see if anybody got hit, go take care of the wounded. But it was, just like the old saying goes, CYA. We just covered ourselves, We didn't want to get hurt.
Well, when we went downtown, we could never tell the difference who was our friend or who was our enemy. We were always told that they were there and that they were after us, and I believe that. There was a lot of Viet Congers in the city, infiltrated or lived in the city, but we could not tell the difference. So we were basically told when you went down there to do what you had to do to keep yourself safe, whatever that entails. When you're in Vietnam, maybe it's just me, but you don't seem to care about anybody or anything, which is, I hate to say that, but you care for your fellow GIs, but the citizens because you never know who was who. It was horrible. That perspective. I don't ever want to lose that kind of respect for any people. I was wrong, but anyway.
Because they don't know who's good and who's bad, and you have to assume everybody's bad.
I do remember at Christmas time, I think back here in the United States, y'all were told that, there's a ceasefire for Christmas. Don't believe that. The life for the citizens of Vietnam, I'm not sure they seemed to like us. They were very friendly to us when we went downtown. I had the opportunity to go downtown a few times. I had the opportunity to ride in what we called the bumper buggy. It was like a motorcycle and looked like a couch sitting on the front of it. And we had the opportunity to ride in the bumper buggies, we call them. We were always told to never go downtown with less than 3 and never go downtown with more than 5. And if you got into a taxi or a bumper buggy that you didn't think was going the right way, do whatever you had to do to stop them.
Beautiful city way was. Enjoying places we were the day before with weapons, the day after just in khaki uniforms, enjoying the day off. Next day I was back in the same area with a weapon. But you never knew who might be and who might not be. That Viet Cong may be just as friendly as a buddy you live with most of your time in the service. And that night he may be there to cut your throat. You couldn't tell one from the other.
They find Viet Cong or North Vietnamese regular troops building up in this area. So boom, you go to this area. And then they just kind of fade into the jungle. And then pretty soon they pop up somewhere else. And so then you're taking people there. Unlike the Korean War, where they started in the south and moved north and just kind of pushed everybody back at the same time, you had so many isolated battles. I flew the whole time in what they called the I Corps. Vietnam was divided into 4 areas. And I Corps was where there was a lot of NVA traffic coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and things like that. The North Vietnamese were ruthless in the way they fought the war. Booby traps all over the place, and we had one helicopter that was going into a landing zone. It was a pretty benign area, but they had strung a wire across the landing zone. No telling how many years it had been there. But there was a wire strung across there that was hooked to explosives. And it knocked the helicopter down, killed several people on the helicopter and stuff. And like I said, there's no telling how long that had been there. I mean, they booby-trapped the whole country.
Unfortunately, the other part that I saw was them. We worked about a block from the morgue, and we saw them bringing soldiers in, probably stacked 5 high in canvas bags into the morgue. And I have to say, it was a horrible sight, plus the odor was pretty bad. So that wasn't a good...
Well, they called the Vietnam War the helicopter war. It's the first time that they'd ever been used like that. They had helicopters in the Korean War, but they were mostly used for picking up wounded and things like that. In Vietnam, it provided tremendous mobility to the troops on the ground. I think part of the problem with that, having it not being what they would consider to be a conventional war, where you have battle lines and things like that, it's a spot war. All in all, I think there were something like 12,000 Hueys in Vietnam. And they flew, just the Hueys, flew over 10 million hours of flight time during the war. And I mean, that's how reliant the war was on the Huey.
We did that. That's where I got shot. They got us in what they call a horseshoe ambush, where they put us, where the sacrificial lamb. So they got us in there, and then all the Viet Cong or whatever sympathizers, they started shooting at us. Well, out of the 32 people in the platoon, there was only 4 of us alive. And one corpsman come in after about an hour and says, "Did you get everybody tagged up?" I said, "Hell no, I tagged up the ones I got to until I got shot. And once I got shot, I just hunkered down right next to a rice paddy because I didn't want to get any more shots. And I got hit here, in my arm, in my shoulder, in my chest, and I got one right in the stomach. And it felt like a million pins. You know how pin cushions? Felt like that. And so I felt around. I couldn't feel anything, you know, a hole. So I put a bandage over it. And I bandaged this up, and I bandaged this up. Didn't know anything about the one back here. Didn't know anything about the one under here. And I bandaged this up, you know, ACE-RAP, or not ACE-RAP, combat bandage. And the corpsman came over and he said, well, why didn't you do the rest? I said, what rest? He says, you got one over here, you got one back over here, you got one over here. I said, I didn't know about those. I said, that's what I got you here for. I got drug out on a poncho, which is a rain jacket. I got drug out of there, and then they put me on a helicopter. Just lifted the poncho up, set me on the floor of the helicopter, and then they flew me to Da Nang. It's not a question of, it's just a question you have to go in and get them. Marine Corps, they don't, one thing I found about Marine Corps, they don't leave anybody behind. So if you got to go in and take somebody, you got to pull them out. And if you're under fire, you got to pull them out someplace where you can treat them. But I tried to save as many as I could. I don't know, you know, I really didn't know anybody's name because I wanted to look up this guy, see if he ever made it back. But we get the mortality rate every other day, but I didn't know if he ever made it to or from, you know, but the only thing I get back was if I documented somebody as a white male and something in there made him a black male, I got a letter on it. Graves Registration would send me a notice that I called this guy a white male. And I contacted Graves Registration. I said, okay, what they brought to me was a bag full of 150 pounds of ground meat. There was a couple of boots in there, a couple of arms in there. I don't know if that's the same person. I just know that's a bag of meat. Well, what do you mean? I said, just what I said. That's all it is because they were in a bomb. They just grabbed them out of a bomb. And whoever's out there putting them in there, they didn't care who it was. They just shoved them in this bag, zipped it up, put it on a pickup or on a Jeep. That's the way they carried them back, on the Jeep. And I was tagging them up and sending them out. Because that was my job, because I was the one that typed up the death certificates.
I was gunshot wounds once and shrapnel wounds twice. So you learn what pain means, and you learn how to deal with it.
War, you might say, is hell.
The war, it kept kind of a catch-22. Having Hueys there and being able to do all this spot battling and things is what kept the war going on. You know, because, like I said, the bad guys show up here, you go get them. Bad guys show up over here, you go get them. And that was happening from the DMZ all the way down to South Vietnam. Just all this spot activity. And so then you had base camps set up here. Okay, they're supposed to keep the enemy subdued in this area. Well, that's all well and good. You have a base camp that might have 100 people there. Okay, and then all of a sudden they get overrun from 1,000 people, and that's an unfair fight. Yeah. So there again, they're relying on the helicopters. Well, the insertion goes very fast because, like I say, you land in a formation. The whole idea, like I say, is to put as many troops on the ground at the same time, so that they're not, so you don't have a small group exposed. So you. And literally, it could be as quick as the skids hit the ground and you rock back up and leave, because, like I said, the troops want to be off the helicopter as quick as possible. An extraction is kind of different because they're typically not standing there in the middle of a field waving at you and waiting for you to land. They're tucked away into the trees and trying to protect themselves, very possibly still in a firefight with Viet Cong or North Vietnamese regulars. And so you come in, touch down, and they start migrating to the helicopter, and typically that's when the door gunners on the helicopter are laying down suppressive fire to give them a chance to get on the helicopter. So you might be on the ground for 3 or 4 or 5 minutes. A lot of times you're also picking up wounded. That takes time. They don't have stretchers. I mean, it's typically 2 GIs carrying a guy and they throw him on the helicopter, and no medics on the helicopter. I mean, so if that was the case, if we were picking up wounded, which happens quite often, then you're taking them to the evac hospital. And the downside to that is that you never know if it was successful or not. It was basically a race against time. I gotta stop for a minute.
And after about 1968, essentially the Viet Cong formations that we had run into south of Da Nang and that sort of thing, they had disappeared. They may be called Viet Cong, but they were all North Vietnamese that had come in and adopted the unit so that they could perpetuate that myth that their whole war effort was really a civil war. It was the people rising and violently resisting the business of government that they felt was being imposed on them. That was the myth that the North Vietnamese had perpetuated throughout the war. And as I said, after about 1968, when the Viet Cong had virtually disappeared, we killed them all. Those Viet Cong units were really North Vietnamese units. They were VC in name only. And what that meant in terms of the enemy, if you will, was that we were facing a pretty rugged, well-trained, and highly motivated enemy. And frankly, as war wound on and American frustration with the war built, our motivation slipped and theirs rose. And that was a significant part of the outcome, what actually happened.
We could see the writing on the wall. I mean, we're moving out. We are abandoning this ship, and we abandon all kinds of equipment too.
Yeah, the third cruise I was on, the last one, was pretty uneventful in that the war was winding down. Okay, the Navy had sent minesweepers. I don't know if maybe people didn't realize, but the U.S. Navy mined the harbor Hai Phong, which is right next to the capital, Hanoi. And they'd done that to prevent as much as possible arms and whatnot being shipped to the North Vietnamese from China and Russia. Both were sending arms to North Vietnamese.
Agent Orange exposure. We never sprayed it, but we were flying into it all the time.
They just every day they flew over there and sprayed that stuff. Now, I think most of it was supposed to be to kill the foliage. That's what it was for. So I don't know what this stuff was, but they'd always go over and fly. And the only thing I just didn't want to be out when they were shooting bullets. And the C-130s that went over, they were shooting bullets.
I had a friend that ended up dying of cancer, and he was in the Air Force, and his job was changing, I mean, he'd be standing in puddles of Agent Orange, changing the valves, loading the airplanes, maintaining the spraying systems and stuff like that. And he died of cancer that they didn't attribute to Agent Orange, but later on they decided yes. And then they came out with and they said, well, only these 3 or 4 kinds of cancers are from Agent Orange.
When I came back, I was tested by a psychiatrist as to my mental capacity. And basically I just took a test on the computer, and they said, thank you, goodbye.
So anyway, we got to this facility, and I thought, along with everybody else, that we were going to be processed there with a future assignment. Okay. We filled out all this paperwork, and they said, okay, the bus is going to take you over to the officers club for lunch. And so we went over to the officers club, had lunch, came back, and we were out of the Army. Bang. And I had at that time decided that I was going to make the Army a career. And that wasn't going to happen. They got rid of, during this process, they got rid of 8,000 helicopter pilots. And so I ended up serving 2 years of a 4-year commitment. And no choice. Thank you very much. Glad you made it home. That was it. I was out of the Army.
Well, it took me a long time. It probably took 10 years after the war to completely unload, if you will, if you ever can completely unload. And frankly, I don't think you can. Did I feel saturated? No, I felt frustrated. It seemed to me, because I had grown up, in the World War II and Korea era, that we should have some sort of symbolic success here. We should be doing some things that indicate we're doing okay. We're doing what the mission requires. And then that led to the question about what does a mission require? And no, I don't think anyone was completely sure of that, especially in 69 and 70 when the U.S. policy turned from leading the active combat effort to sort of Vietnamization, if you will, and that is making the South Vietnamese fight their own war.
See, if I would have went to San Diego, I would have had a medical discharge. But I had an honorable discharge, so I had to fight through the VA for 35 years before I got my 100%. Because the VA didn't recognize what we did as a war. They said it was a police action, which in 1962 it was. But when you have 58,000 men got killed, that's more than a police action. I got off the plane. That's the first steak dinner I had since I joined the service. And I only got to eat half of it because they said, we're going to go. And I said, I'll wait for the next bus. He said, no, you're going now.
The only thing that I felt that when we flew out of the San Francisco airport, the people there would just totally ignore us like we didn't exist and didn't seem to want to talk to us, which, I mean, I could have cared less. I'm going home. I don't care about you. But I think that feeling was in the air back then in '66, that they didn't like us. And you know what? We didn't do anything. We didn't we had to go over it. We didn't have a choice, and we didn't do anything. It wasn't our fault. But the people in the U.S., for some reason, they thought we were the bad guys. They thought we were I don't know what they thought.
You basically were told that you were not to travel in your uniform.
I did not have that experience. I've heard a lot of my other fellow brothers and sisters come home. They got spit on. They got cussed out at the airports, that are airports, and that was, that had to be horrible for them, and even to live with that afterwards, to think, man, you went over and did what you did, and this is how the American people think about you, that you lose a little bit of respect for a lot of the American people for a while. It takes you a while to gain back. It's not good. It wasn't good, and I can't believe that they didn't understand why. I mean, why? How is it my fault? What did we do over there? Because when you're over there, you do what you got to do to stay alive and defend your country. That's your mission.
This university was a hotbed of war protesting. Okay. You had everybody from the Black Panthers to Students for Democratic Society, and they a lot of activity on campus, anti-war. Okay, parades and demonstrations and all the rest. And then Kent State came along. Yeah, as far as the Kent State and the demonstrations that were going on literally all over the country, I didn't feel anti-war. I wasn't for the war, or if I was, I'd kind of mellowed, as I got towards the time I served in the Navy. But I'd never protested, I never joined anything on campus or off campus as far as demonstrations. I got to watch what was going on in Vietnam every night on the news. About 15 minutes of the evening news was always devoted to Vietnam. And that was probably didn't help the war effort. I think a lot of people watching the news every night and the body counts, only help people turn against the war. But I wasn't one of them. I just kind of doing my duty for my country.
I mean, it was surreal to have to choreograph anti-war demonstrations as I did. I did anti-war demonstrations in both Born on the 4th of July and later in Forrest Gump.
Like I said, my father was a career military man. I traveled all over the world. I saw what the rest of the world was like, and I thought that what we were attempting to do in Vietnam was a worthwhile cause.
I just want to say now that it's my fellow brothers and sisters is why I'm doing what I'm doing with the Vietnam vets and American Legion, and paying them back for what they went through. And I was fortunate I didn't go through anything near to what a lot of those guys went through. And my heart goes out to them and their families. Right, I have a big brotherhood now with the Vietnam Veterans Group and the American Legion. Big. And thank God. Yeah. Gives me the opportunity to pay back.
We weren't very well received. I mean, there was a big stigma about, atrocities and all that kind of stuff, which they didn't understand. They didn't know what they were demonstrating against because they weren't there. Just as an example, they say, well, you baby killer and you're killing civilians and stuff like that. When I was at Marble Mountain, we had a situation where we had a big dump facility where we took all the ammo boxes and stuff like that and load them up in a deuce and a half, and you had to go out of the airport, the compound, and it was several miles away. The people, there was 4 guys, 2 guys in the back of the truck, 2 guys in the front of the truck to help unload and all this kind of stuff. When they got down to the dump, there was a bunch of kids begging for whatever they could get. And on the way back, the truck blew up. They had put a hand grenade with a rubber band around it in the gas tank. I mean, these guys were distracting the people and somebody, and they said one of the guys in the back of the truck got killed, the other one got wounded real bad. Both of the guys in the front were beat up from the explosion and stuff, but they both survived with no problem. But they said the only people that were around that truck were these little kids.
But being spoke to or spit on or anything at that time, I don't think that really started happening until in the 67. But I've always talked about Vietnam to people who ask questions about it. Never afraid to talk to them about it. But I know men today still don't talk about it, except to another veteran, because people just don't understand what it was like. Be down in the mud and being shot at and being caught in ambushes and what have you.
I was proud of my service, I'll say that. I didn't let the war get to me, did what I had to do. No regrets. It was, looking back now, the whole thing was a total waste of time and lives. But that's behind us. So hopefully we never had another Vietnam.
I mean, I take medication for nightmares. I don't sleep. Mostly it's to keep you from having these panic wake-ups, things like that.
I never felt like I was outside. I'm proud to have served and still proud to have served. I don't let people knock me down or run me down.
And what I discovered, and I think this is true across the spectrum of Vietnam veterans, what I discovered was that it's easy to be bitter. It's easy to think you were misused. It's easy to think you were sacrificial lambs. And that creates an extraordinary amount of bitterness. And that bitterness can live in your gut. And if you are unwilling or unable to talk about it, to express it in some fashion, then it festers. It festers and becomes a real problem. And it develops into mental problems and behavioral problems and self-medication and all of the things that a great number of Vietnam veterans experienced. And I thought, there's a lesson here. We, the Vietnam veterans, must be willing to talk about it. As painful as you may think it is, and as few people that you can find who are willing to listen and with an open mind, you've got to find those people and you've got to talk to, and you've got to get this stuff out. You can't let it sit in there and fester. And unfortunately, I was able to give that advice, but I don't know how much it was heeded. They don't think they can find anybody who wants to listen or who would understand. And so they don't. They just shut it off and let it live inside them. And that living inside them is deadly. It's dangerous.
Well, coming back home and knowing my fellow soldiers were still over there and the war was getting worse and worse, even though it was a police accident, it was war. They was getting worse and worse. And you know what? I tried not to think a lot about it. I tried to wipe out Vietnam for quite a while of my life. And later on in life, I felt that I owe something to my fellow brothers and sisters that were over there. And then I've had the opportunity to join Vietnam Veterans of America here in Tucson, and also the American Legion. And that's very rewarding to me to be able to give back to my fellow soldiers, even though I didn't give it back at the time they were over there, but I do now. And I'm very active in both them and in the American Legion, and I'm in the Color Guard in the American Legion because I feel every soldier deserves a military honors.